Welcome back to Hexes, Haunts, and Howls. I'm your host, Cupcake. Tonight's episode was created per request. A listener asked for something cold, isolated, and ancient. So tonight, we're headed high above the tree line, into silence, into the mountains that do not forgive mistakes. Tonight, we're talking about the Yeti. This isn't the pop culture, snow monster, or fuzzy silhouette on a grainy photograph. This is the Yeti, as it was known long before the world tried to name it, through folklore, witness accounts, and the people who believed it was never meant to be found. As always, we'll explore the history, the legends, and the darker possibilities surrounding this entity, and why so many who go looking for it never come back. So settle in, turn the lights down low, and listen closely, because some things don't want to be discovered, and some mountains are still guarded. Before the world knew the word Yeti, before explorers chased it with cameras and measuring tapes, before headlines turned it into a monster, the Yeti already existed. Not as a curiosity, not as a trophy, but as something older than names. Long before Western expeditions ever dared to challenge the Himalayan peaks, the people who lived among those mountains already understood something vital. The mountains were not empty, and they were not meant to be conquered. Among the Sherpa people of Nepal and Tibet, stories of a mysterious being passed quietly from generation to generation, spoken with reverence, not excitement. These were not tales told to scare children into obedience. These were warnings, lessons, reminders of balance. To the Sherpa, there was no single Yeti. There were many. Each one known by a different name. Each one tied to a different part of the mountain. Each one serving a different purpose. The first was called the Mite. Mite translate loosely to man-bear, or man-like creature. This was the Yeti, most commonly resembled what we imagine today. Tall, upright, broad-shouldered, and humanoid in shape. Mite was said to walk on two legs, leaving behind enormous footprints in the snow. It lived at high elevations, where the air thins and human strength fails. Encounters with the Mite were rare, but when they happened, they were unforgettable. Witnesses described the overwhelming sense of being watched, not hunted, but judged. Mite were not known for attacking without cause. Instead, it appeared to those who had ventured too far, climbed too recklessly, or ignored the silent warnings of the mountains. Then there was the Mite, smaller, faster, more animal-like. Mite were said to inhabit lower forested regions beneath the snowline. Some accounts describe it moving on all fours. Others say it could stand upright when threatened. It was stealthy, elusive, and known for avoiding humans entirely. Mite wasn't violent, but it was curious. It was blamed for missing food, disturbed camps, and strange noises in the trees at night. Climbers would wake to footprints circling their tents, but never leading closer, almost as if the creatures were inspecting them, deciding whether they belonged there. And then there was Juti, the most feared of them all. Yeti was massive, powerful, dangerous. Stories say it could kill yaks with ease, that it roamed the highest and most hostile elevations, where survival itself feels like a curse. Yeti was not curious about humans. It was intolerant of them. Unlike Miti or Meite, encounters with Yeti rarely ended well. Those who claimed to see it described a creature towering over men, moving with terrifying confidence through deep snow and sheer rock faces. Its presence wasn't just frightening, it was final. A clear message that the traveler had crossed a line they could not uncross. But here's what's important. Despite the fear surrounding Yeti, despite the danger, the Yeti was never considered evil. In Sherpa belief, the Yeti was not a monster. It was a protector, a spiritual guardian of the mountains. The Himalayas are among the most sacred landscapes on Earth. They are believed to be alive, conscious, and deeply sensitive to imbalance. The Yeti, in this worldview, was not a predator, but an enforcer, a being that ensured humans respected boundaries. Seeing a Yeti wasn't interpreted as a bad omen or an omen of death. It was a warning. A sign that you had climbed too high, taken too much, or ignored the mountain's authority. Many Sherpa guides believed avalanches, sudden storms, and fatal falls were not random. They were consequences, the mountains correcting arrogance. And the Yeti was a symbol of that correction. There were stories of climbers who laughed off warnings, who dismissed local beliefs as superstition, who pushed forward against advice, and they were never seen again. No bodies, no gear, no trace, except silence. And then there are the monasteries. High in the mountains, Buddhist monasteries have long claimed to possess Yeti relics, scalps, bones, even their hands, kept not as proof, but as sacred objects. These relics were never displayed for curiosity. They were protected, hidden, and shown only to those deemed worthy. When Western explorers finally learned of these relics, they demanded access. Some monasteries refused outright. Others allowed brief glimpses, but never explanation. Because to explain the Yeti as an animal was to misunderstand it entirely. The Yeti was not just flesh and bone. It was spirit and land intertwined. As time passed and the outside world began pushing deeper into the Himalayas, the meaning of the Yeti began to change. Western explorers brought cameras, rifles, and measuring tools. They didn't ask why the Yeti existed. They asked, what is it? Was it a bear? A missing humanoid? A surviving Neanderthal? But in doing so, something vital was lost. The Yeti was stripped of its role as guardian and reduced to a specimen, a puzzle to be solved, a prize to be claimed. And perhaps that's when sightings changed. Reports became more aggressive, encounters more frightening, disappearances more frequent. Some Sherpa elders believe the Yeti became angrier as the mountains were disrespected, as sacred peaks were conquered, as climbers planted flags and claimed victories, because the mountains were never meant to be won, and the Yeti was never meant to be found. It wasn't hiding from us. It was keeping us out. And maybe it still is. By the time the Western world became obsessed with the idea of the Yeti, the creature had already existed in legend for centuries. But legends weren't enough. Explorers wanted proof. And in 1951, they thought they finally found it. That year, British mountaineer and explorer Eric Shipton was part of a reconnaissance expedition on Everest. Shipton was not a sensationalist. He was respected and known for documenting his journeys with care. While crossing the Menlung Glacier in Nepal, Shipton and his team came across something that stopped them cold. A line of footsteps. Not animal tracks, not human boot prints. These footprints were enormous, measuring roughly 13 inches long, deeply pressed into the snow at an altitude where very few living things can survive. Each step was spaced far apart, suggesting long strides and immense strength. Shipton photographed the prints carefully, placing an ice pick beside one for scale. Those photographs would go on to become the most famous Yeti evidence in history. When they were published, the world exploded. Scientists argued, newspapers speculated, skeptics claimed misidentified bear tracks distorted by melting snow. Believers pointed out details that didn't match any known animal, especially the shape of the toes and the clear impression of a foot arch. But what unsettled Shipton most wasn't just the size. It was the location. These prints weren't near villages. They weren't near any known animal routes. They were deep in hostile, frozen terrain, somewhere no human would walk barefoot, and no known animal should leave such a clean, deliberate trail. Shipton never claimed to know what made these tracks, but he also never dismissed them. Which brings us back to the monasteries. The Buddhist monasteries that were isolated high in the Himalayas have long claimed to possess relics, objects kept not for proof, but for reverence. One of the most infamous is the so-called Yeti scalp. For decades, a monastery at Pang Bak claimed to hold the preserved scalp of a Yeti. When Western explorers finally learned of it, they traveled great distances just to glimpse it. The monks were reluctant, not because they feared ridicule, but because they feared disrespect. The scalp, dark, coarse, and shaped in a way that didn't clearly match any known animal, was displayed only briefly. It was never handled, never examined freely. When scientists later tested hair samples taken from similar relics, results were inconclusive. Some samples matched known animals, others didn't match anything on record. Bones, too, have been claimed. Fragments said to belong to the Yeti skeletons, stored quietly in monasteries and private collections. Again and again, attempts to analyze them have been blocked restricted, or ended in results that raised more questions than answers. But to the monks, the relics were never meant to convince outsiders. They were reminders, proof that the mountains were protected. And then there are the modern encounters. Because if the Yeti were only a relic of the past, sightings would have stopped long ago. They haven't. In recent decades, climbers and trekkers have reported experiences that feel disturbingly consistent. Screams, not animal howls, not human voices, something in between. High-altitude climbers describe hearing deep, echoing vocalizations late at night, sounds that travel unnaturally far through thin air. Some say the screams seem to circle their camps, moving too quickly to track. Shadows. Massive shapes seen through blowing snow. Figures moving against the wind. Something standing upright on ridgelines, watching. But then, there are the footprints. Fresh prints appearing overnight. Longer than any bear track, deeper than the snow should allow. Always spaced too far apart, always leading away from camps, never toward them. Many climbers admit they don't report these encounters publicly. Why? Because in the climbing community, fear is dangerous. Admitting you saw something you can't explain can end careers. So these stories spread quietly, guide to guide, climber to climber, shared in base camps, whispered over exhausted breaths. And then there are the disappearances. People who vanish without signs of avalanches, without equipment failure, without tracks leading down the mountain. Just gone. Some Sherpa guides refuse to climb certain routes after specific sightings. Others turn back without explanation, saying only that the mountain has spoken. And when asked about the Yeti, they don't laugh. They don't speculate. They say the same thing over and over again. Some places are not meant for us. The evidence has never been enough to satisfy science, but it has always been enough to change the minds of those who experience it. Footprints that shouldn't exist. Relics that won't give clear answers. Voices that don't belong to anything we know. Maybe the question isn't whether the Yeti exists. Maybe the question is, why does it let us see it at all? Once footprints were photographed, once relics were sampled, once climbers began whispering the same stories, science stepped in to do what it always does: explain it away. For decades, researchers have tried to solve the Yeti mystery, not by asking, what is it, but by asking what it could be instead. The most common conclusion is simple, convenient, and deeply unsatisfying to many who live in the Himalayas. The Yeti, they say, is just a bear. In 2014, and again in later studies, scientists conducted DNA testing on hair samples claimed to belong to Yetis. The results pointed toward known species, most often the Himalayan brown bear or the Tibetan blue bear, rare animals already adapted to high altitudes. Headlines celebrated the conclusion. Mystery solved. Except, not really. Because those DNA tests came with quiet footnotes few people read. Many of the samples were decades old. Some had unknown origins. Others were taken from collections without clear chains of custody. And crucially, none of those samples were taken directly from a confirmed Yeti encounter. They were tested after the fact, removed from context, disconnected from witness experiences. Science had matched DNA, but it hadn't matched behavior. This is where the disagreement begins. Among local Sherpa communities, the bear explanation is often rejected, not because they don't understand bears, but because they understand them too well. These are people who share the mountains with bears, who recognize their tracks, who know their sounds, who understand how they move, hunt, and survive. When locals describe Yeti encounters, they don't describe bears behaving strangely. They describe something else entirely. Bears do not walk long distances upright. They do not leave narrow, human-like footprints with visible arches. They do not move silently across ridgelines at impossible speeds. And they do not vocalize in a way climbers describe deep, resonant calls that echo unnaturally across valleys. Altitude raises even more questions. Yes, bears can survive at high elevations, but only to a point. Many reported Yeti sightings occur above 18,000 feet in regions with minimal food, extreme cold, and oxygen levels that challenge even the most elite climbers. A bear at that altitude would be struggling to survive. Lethargic, starving, and vulnerable. Yet, Yeti encounters describe strength, speed, confidence, and control. Footprints appear in deep snow where bears would sink or avoid traveling altogether. Stride lengths suggest long-legged, upright movement, not the staggered gait of a quadruped shifting to two legs briefly. And then there's timing. Many sightings occur outside known bear activity seasons, including periods when bears should be hibernating, which raises an uncomfortable possibility. If it isn't a bear, then what is it? Some scientists have cautiously suggested an unknown primate, a relic hominid adapted to extreme environments. Others propose a rare combination of misidentification, environmental stress, and psychological priming. But none of these explanations account for everything. They don't explain why witnesses across decades report nearly identical vocalizations, why footprints appear in single-file lines as if deliberately walking, why sightings cluster around sacred or restricted regions, or why experienced climbers describe the same details independently. Science excels at explaining patterns, but the Yeti doesn't behave like a pattern. It behaves like something avoiding classification. And that's where the frustration sets in. Western researchers arrive with equipment, collect samples, publish papers, and leave. Local people remain, living alongside the unknown. To them, the bear explanation feels dismissive. Not because science is wrong, but because it refuses to admit uncertainty. Because acknowledging something unexplained means admitting the mountains still hold secrets. And perhaps the most honest scientific answer so far is this: we don't have enough data. We don't have a body. We don't have a living specimen. We don't have indisputable proof. But we also don't have a complete explanation. The Yeti exists in a space science hates, a gap between what we know and what we can prove. And until something crosses that gap, the mystery remains. Because if the Yeti were just a bear, we wouldn't still be asking these questions. There is a reason most Yeti encounters don't end up in reports. Not because there's nothing to say, but because there's too much. Fear behaves differently at high altitude. Up there, the world shrinks. Your vision narrows. Your breathing becomes shallow and deliberate. And sound? Sound stops behaving the way it should. In whiteout conditions, the wind erases depth and distance. Snow absorbs sound, then releases it in strange ways. A sound can seem close one moment and impossibly far the next. It can circle you, it can rise from below and crash down from above. Climbers describe hearing vocalizations that don't echo normally. Not sharp calls or animal cries, but long, resonant sounds that roll through the air like something testing its voice. Not calling out, announcing its presence. Some say the sound vibrates through their chest more than their ears. Others describe it as layered, multiple tones overlapping in a way no animal should produce. And the worst part, you can't tell where it's coming from. In a whiteout, direction disappears. There's no horizon, no up, no down, just endless movement and noise. A scream can be 10 feet away or a mile. Your body reacts before your mind does. Heart racing, hand shaking, breath coming too fast. And then comes the second fear. The fear of being watched. Not just stared at. Assessed. Climbers talk about moments when they suddenly stop, without knowing why. An instinctive freeze. The sense that movement itself would be noticed. They feel it on exposed ridgelines, where there's nowhere to hide. No trees, no cover. Just open snow and open sky. You realize something important in those moments. If something is watching you up there, you cannot run. At that altitude, running isn't an option. You can barely walk. Every step costs oxygen. Every mistake is fatal. And whatever is watching you, it's not struggling. Some climbers report shadows moving against the wind. Others describe a shape standing still while the storm moves around it, as if the weather itself avoids it. No sudden attacks, no dramatic charges, just presence. Which is worse? Because predators that want to kill you don't wait. Whatever this is, it waits. And then there's the silence that follows. After the sound fades, after the shadow disappears, a silence so complete it feels intentional. That's often when climbers pack up and leave, without finishing ascents they trained years for, without explanations, without taking summit photos. They descend quietly, and later, when asked why, they say nothing. Because fear like that doesn't translate well. In the climbing world, reputation is survival. Admitting panic, hallucinations, or unexplained encounters can cost sponsorships, guide work, and credibility. So stories are buried, only shared in private, guide to guide, Sherpa to Sherpa. Always with the same ending: I won't go back there. Not because of avalanches, not because of storms, because of something that made them feel small. And that's the true fear of the Yeti. It doesn't chase you. It doesn't need to. It reminds you that you are fragile, that you are trespassing, that the mountain is not yours. And up there, fear doesn't scream, it watches. After all the stories, the photographs, the tests, the fear, we're left with the same question people have been asking for generations. What is the Yeti? And maybe that's the wrong question, because every attempt to define it, to pin it down as an animal, a relic, or a mistake, fails in the same way. The Yeti doesn't behave like something that wants to be understood. It appears briefly. It leaves traces without answers. It retreats before certainty can take hold. Which leads to a quieter, more unsettling theory. What if the Yeti isn't a creature in the way we think of creatures? What if it's a boundary? A living expression of the mountain's refusal. Throughout history, humans have marked territory by naming it, climbing it, and conquering it. The Himalayas resist that instinct. They take lives without warning. They erase footprints. They rewrite maps. The Yeti fits that pattern perfectly. It doesn't attack cities. It doesn't follow roads. It doesn't seek us out. It exists where survival is already uncertain, where arrogance becomes fatal. In this theory, the Yeti isn't hunting humans. It's monitoring them. A presence that appears when limits are crossed, when balance is disrupted, when humans forget how small they are. This would explain why encounters feel deliberate, why climbers describe being watched, assessed, and then spared. A predator kills. A guardian decides. It would also explain why evidence is never enough. Footprints fade, relics degrade, DNA points sideways instead of forward. The Yeti allows proof, just not confirmation. And maybe that is intentional. Because when something is fully understood, it loses power. And the mountains cannot afford to lose their power. There's another reason this theory endures. The people who live closest to the Yeti don't demand answers. They respect boundaries. They listen. They turn back when warned. It's outsiders like us who demand explanations, who insist on climbing higher, pushing further, and filming longer. And maybe the Yeti is what happens when the land pushes back. So if you're waiting for a final answer, for a body, for undeniable proof, you may be waiting forever, because the Yeti doesn't need belief to exist. It needs distance. And as long as humans keep crossing lines they don't understand, something in those mountains will be there to remind them. Quietly, patiently, watching. If you've experienced something strange in the mountains, something that you can't explain, something that still lingers in the back of your mind, I invite you to share it. You can send your experiences to hexes, haunts, and howls at gmail.com. Again, that's hexes, haunts, and howls, all one word, at gmail.com. All stories will remain anonymous. Some places are not empty. Some warnings don't come with words. And some guardians don't want to be seen. Thank you for listening to Hexes, Haunts, and Howls. I'm your host, Cupcake. Until next time, stay sweet.